Before you do any work on your CZ, you must make sure the bolt is away from the rifle, you've removed the magazine, and there's no ammunition in the breech. Then what you need to do is find some sort of support. Here is a purpose-built moulding, but you can use a piece of rolled up rag or a socket. So it's got the hole in the middle, so the pin that's been driven out will pass through the hole in the socket. Doesn't matter what particular method you use to support. You need a drift about 3mm, 2.5mm, something like that. And what you're aiming to do is remove the rear pin from the trigger, that one there. If there's a burr on the end of the pin while it's sticking through on the trigger blade itself, just get yourself a hobby power tool, the sort that uses a 1-inch grinding disc, cutting disc, and with the tool in motion just gently wipe over the burr, remove the burr, and that will enable you to remove the pin. Once you've removed the pin, this will allow the trigger unit to swivel down, and you'll be able to get at this part here where the spring slides over. You'll also note there's a very small washer and as always, it's always awkward for the film, but on that spigot there's a small washer, and all you need to do is when you release that pin and swivel it down, pull the spring off, replace with your new spring, line it all up, and then just get your pin and drive it back in with a few gentle taps. Make sure that it's flush with this end and the opposite side. Quite simple to do. One thing that's most important, that part there is the sear. You do not want to remove the pin that holds the sear in place. Inside is a small spring, and at the end of that spring is a ball. That ball goes into a hole, and believe me, it is very, very difficult to remove. Simply by putting a lighter load spring on this spigot here, that will make the pull of the trigger considerably lighter. With a selection of springs, you can easily try one at a time, going from the hardest pull down to the lightest pull. If you want to put the tube in for the creep, the idea is the sear remains in place and you half knock out that pin there. That enables you to put the tube over this pin here and takes up some of the clearance so that the so-called slack is removed. Depending on the thickness of the tube, depending on the amount of creep you have, that's where you put the tube to reduce the amount of creep. Luckily, I have no creep on this. Well, I'll say no creep, very little creep, and this didn't require a tube fitted, so I kept that pin in place, and if I wanted to replace the spring, as mentioned, I just remove that pin there, the rear one. I've mentioned about using a support when I'm driving out a pin. They might be quite tight and you do need to use the correct size punch to knock them out, but without this support here for the trigger, there is a danger that you might break the trigger blade. As you see here, the one half has been broken off. This metal is quite brittle and easily snapped. All it needs is a small amount of bend, and for you to try and correct that, the motion of moving it one way or the other way is enough to snap it. Although it's just a simple piece of metal in many people's eyes, these are quite expensive to replace, so you do need to take great care when you're removing the trigger. Otherwise, you won't have a one-piece trigger blade like that. You'll have a two-piece trigger blade. For the cost of a replacement trigger and a trigger kit, a spring kit, you could get a replacement. This is a Timney trigger unit, a replacement for the original blade and all the springs, the sear, everything. To put a Timney in place, you simply remove the trigger pin there at the back, then the sear pin, and you remove the sear complete with the spring and the ball. And once that's clear, quite simply just line up the holes, insert the pins into the holes, and that is the replacement done. All you need to do is lightly tap down these two pins here. Once the two pins are in place, back and front, you'll notice there is a small grub screw. All you need to do is insert an Allen key, just nip it up, and that stops any movement from the Timney unit, and the action stops any waving around. It doesn't have to be very tight, just insert the Allen key, just pinch it up, make sure there's no slack, and that's all there is to do to place the Timney trigger onto your action. There is an adjusting screw there, but my advice is, rather than show you my personal likes of trigger weight, trigger pull, any other adjustment that I might prefer, I recommend you look on the website or read the instructions that come with your Timney trigger, and you make your own adjustments. One other thing you need to be aware of, the Timney trigger is slightly wider than a standard unit, and it's slightly longer. You need to make sure there's enough clearance at the back here for this part of the action of the trigger. If this is any way pushed like that, when you bolt everything back in place, it holds the trigger either in the partly fired position or the fired position. So when you operate the bolt, it will discharge the round, or the trigger will be so light because it's already partly pulled that it will go off with the slightest of touch. So you need to make sure there's plenty of clearance between the end of the trigger and the wood of the stock.